The last thing I'd like to talk about before wrapping up this module, and indeed the entire course, is certificate pinning. And before I explain what certificate pinning is, I want to talk briefly about why it's useful. Let me give you a perfect example of that. Back in 2011, a certificate authority known as DigiNotar was severely compromised. And when I say severely, I mean to the point that the attackers were actually able to issue certificates for domains such as Google, wildcard certificates no less, for star.google.com. This seriously undermines the very fabric on which this public key infrastructure of certificates and authorities is based, and it does so because it meant that the attacker could create entirely legitimate certificates for any domain they liked. We've just been playing around in Fiddler, creating self-signed certificates that weren't trusted by devices, at least not until we compromised them. These guys were using vulnerabilities in DigiNotar to create real certificates that were genuinely issued by a trusted certificate authority. What that then meant is that if the attacker could get in the middle of the communication of someone accessing a resource like Google, they could actually serve up a legitimate certificate. All the messages we give people about looking for padlocks, making sure there's no warnings, even inspecting the certificate, all those warnings almost entirely go out the window when you've got a compromised CA issuing certificates. After DigiNotar was hacked, the certificates that were fraudulently issued by the attackers were used extensively in Iran. And indeed, per the news article here, extensively could mean many hundreds of thousands of individuals had their traffic man-in-the-middled. Now, I said it's almost impossible to tell if the certificate is legitimate or not, and the almost caveat is down to the fact that Google certificates are not issued by DigiNotar. In fact, Google has their own CA. So had someone been diligent enough to actually look at the certificate and realize that it wasn't issued by the correct CA, then yes, they could have identified that an attack was happening. But let's face it, that's not feasible, certainly not for consumers. Now, I tell you all this simply to establish that sometimes there is a risk, a very, very small risk, but a risk nonetheless, that an apparently valid certificate can be served up to a client by a man in the middle who managed to fraudulently issue it for the domain the client is connecting to. There is a way around this, and it's called certificate pinning. And I'd like to give you an example of that in a real-world app right now.